The blade was already at her throat when Elise Whitlock realized she had made a catastrophic mistake. She had followed the sound of breathing into the ruins of Blackmere Station, the old underground rail depot that the city of Vienna had sealed off 40 years ago, and everyone above ground had long since forgotten. She had followed it because she was running, because she was bleeding from a cut above her left eyebrow, because 3 of the High Court's enforcers were somewhere behind her in the dark, and because when you are a human girl who has accidentally witnessed a vampire execution in the ballroom of a 5-star hotel, your options narrow very quickly. The blade was cold, not a knife. A sword, short and elegant, pressed with extraordinary precision against the pulse point in her neck, held by a hand so still it might have been sculpted from white stone. She did not scream. She had learned, in the 6 weeks since she had stumbled into this world, that screaming was the most useless thing a human could do in the dark. Instead, Elise said very carefully, "I am not one of them." Silence, the kind that pressed against the ears. Then a voice came out of the absolute black, and it was low and precise, and carried the layered resonance of something very old that had learned to speak like a man but had never quite forgotten what it was. "You are bleeding," the voice said. "That makes you either very brave or very stupid. The court does not send bleeding humans as bait. The court just tried to kill me," Elise said, "so I would appreciate if you did not finish the job." A pause. The sword did not move. "Who are you?" the voice asked. "Elise Whitlock. I was a research assistant at the Runaway archive until 3 days ago when I found something I was not supposed to find, and now half the city wants me dead." "Who are you?" The sword withdrew. Not slowly, not hesitantly, but with the decisive grace of someone who had made a judgment and committed to it completely. A light came on, not electric, something older, a lantern, the flame blue, white and cold, and in its glow, Elise Whitlock saw him for the first time. He was tall and lean, and built like old iron, beneath a long black coat that had seen better centuries. His skin was the pale of fresh snow, his hair bone-white and falling past his jaw, and his eyes were the deep silver grey of a storm front moving over open water. There was a scar along his left jaw, thin as a thread, that looked like it had been made by something that should have killed him. He had the bearing of a man who had never once in his entire existence needed to prove to anyone that he was dangerous, because it was simply obvious. He looked at her with those silver eyes, and something shifted in his expression that she could not name yet. She would learn to name it later. Much later, but in that first moment what she saw was recognition without prior meeting, the look of someone who has been alone for a very long time and has just heard something that sounds, faintly and terrifyingly, like home. "My name," he said, "is Tavian Von Carstein." The name hit her like cold water. Every researcher at the Runaway archive knew that name. Every student of vampire political history, every scholar of the old blood laws, every person who had spent more than a month in the underground world of vampire courts and ancient vows knew that name, because that name belonged to a dead man, Tavian Von Carstein, crown prince of the Von Carstein line, heir to the obsidian throne, had been declared dead by the High Court of Mortlach 14 months ago. His funeral had been held in the great cathedral beneath the city. His seat on the court council had been sealed in black wax. His mother, the Empress Vorothea, had gone into mourning that the old records said would last a century. The court had mourned him. The court had buried him. The court had moved on. And here he stood, in the ruins beneath Vienna, holding a blue flame lantern and watching her bleed. "You are supposed to be dead," Elise said. "I am aware," Tavian Von Carstein replied. She pressed her fingers to the cut above her eyebrow. The blood was slowing. She looked at him steadily. And he looked back, and neither of them flinched, and the sound of boots on stone echoed from somewhere far behind her in the tunnels, and reminded them both that this moment of stunned stillness was a luxury neither of them could afford. "We need to move," he said. "Agreed," she said. He turned, and she followed, because in that moment, with the court's enforcers behind her and a dead prince ahead of her, following seemed like the only rational choice available. And Elise Whitlock had always, above everything else, been rational. She had grown up rational. She had been the girl in school who read the textbooks twice and still asked questions, who got a scholarship to study archival history because she genuinely loved the weight of old documents and the secrets they kept. She had talked her way into the Draveur archive at 22, cataloguing a collection that the archive's public face called historical records of Eastern European noble families. And that was in reality the most comprehensive collection of vampire political documentation in the Western world. She had not known that when she applied. She had figured it out over 18 months of patient, careful, brilliant archival work, and she had kept that knowledge to herself. Because Elise had learned early that the most dangerous thing you can do with a secret is tell it before you understand exactly what it costs. What she had found 3 days ago was not a secret she had been looking for. It was a document buried inside a false bottom box at the back of a restricted archive shelf, misfiled under the completely mundane heading of Correspondence, Administrative, 1887. She had opened it expecting to catalogue property records. What she found instead was a formal death warrant, sealed with the crest of the High Court of Mortlach, bearing the name Tavian Von Carstein, and dated 14 months ago. Beneath the warrant was a second document, a private communication in cipher, and Elise had broken the cipher in 4 hours because she was very good at her job. The communication revealed that the death warrant had been fabricated, that Tavian Von Carstein had not died, that he had been deliberately hidden, and that the members of the court who had engineered his removal had done so in order to seize control of the obsidian throne before the old blood law of succession could transfer it to him upon his coming-of-age year as prince. She had photographed everything. Then she had walked out of the archive and gone straight to her apartment to plan her next move, and she had opened her door to find 2 men already inside, going through her files. She had run. She had been running for 3 days, and now she was in the tunnels beneath Vienna following a vampire prince who was supposed to be a ghost, and the court's enforcers were behind her, and ahead of her was nothing but dark stone and blue-white flame, and the broad, certain shoulders of a man who moved through the underground like he had been born to it. They ran for nearly 20 minutes. Elise was fit. She ran 4 days a week out of habit and a deep personal commitment to not being useless in emergencies, and she still had to push to keep Tavian's pace. He moved with that particular liquid efficiency that vampires had, no wasted motion, no hesitation, his coat flowing behind him as he navigated turns she could not see until the lantern light caught them. He stopped her finally in a chamber that had once been a switching room. Old iron lavers rusted to their housings lined one wall. The chamber smelled of stone and something older, cedar and cold fire, which she would later learn was simply the way Tavian von Carstein smelled, the scent of a centuries-old bloodline pressed into living form. He set the lantern on a stone shelf and turned to look at her. She was breathing hard. He was not breathing at all in that moment, which told her he was thinking, and vampires at full focus sometimes simply forgot to perform the motion of breath. "How did you find this tunnel?" he asked. "I did not find it. I was running, and I fell through a collapsed section of road surface about half a kilometer back. I dropped about 3 meters onto a transit platform that has not been used since 1983. Something that might have been surprised respect moved across his face. And you simply kept running. I was being chased by people with very sharp things, Elise said. Stopping seemed counterproductive. He studied her. It was a thorough, careful study, the kind that missed nothing and pretended to miss nothing. And Elise met it without flinching because she had been studied by people who wanted things from her before, and she had learned that flinching only invited more pressure. "You know who I am," he said. "Tavian von Carstein, Crown Prince, reportedly deceased, currently very much alive in a Victorian rail switching room beneath the city." She paused. "I know considerably more than that, actually. I found your death warrant at the Draveur archive 3 days ago. I also found the communication that proves it was fabricated." The stillness that came over him then was not the comfortable stillness of a predator at rest. It was the absolute, charged stillness of someone who has just heard the thing they have been waiting 14 months to hear, the thing they had begun to believe they might never hear, the thing that changes everything. "You have proof," he said. It was not quite a question. Photographs. Digital, time-stamped, backed up to 3 separate encrypted locations. She held his gaze. "I am a very good archivist, Prince von Carstein. I do not handle volatile documents without taking precautions." He moved, and it was very sudden, not toward her, but to the wall, pressing his palm flat against the stone, as though he needed something solid to hold him in the moment. His jaw tightened. His silver eyes closed for just a breath. And in that breath, Elise saw something she had not expected to see. Not danger, not pride, not the cold calculation she had braced for. She saw exhaustion. She saw 14 months of being alone in the dark, cut off from his line, his throne, his family, his entire world, and she saw what it cost him to remain and standing under the weight of it. She looked away, because that moment was his, and she was not cruel enough to watch him have it. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled and precise. "They will kill you for what you know." "They were already trying to kill me for what I found," Elise pointed out. "The information just makes me more worth keeping alive, if the right people know it exists." He turned to look at her. The silver eyes were clear again, calculating, but not cold. "You understand the blood laws?" "Enough to know that a fabricated death warrant issued against a crown prince is treason at the highest order under the Mortlach Code, and that anyone presenting documented proof of that treason to the Empress herself would be protected under the ancient vow of the witness's right." She paused. "I have been doing my research." Tavian Von Carstein stared at her for a long, measuring moment. "Most humans who learn about the courts," he said quietly, "either run screaming or attempt to use what they know as leverage for money." "I am not most humans," Elise said, "and I am not interested in money. I am interested in not being in a tunnel, and in the documents I found being seen by the people who need to see them. Beyond that, my interests are fairly flexible." Something changed in his expression then. It was subtle. A fractional shift in the quality of his attention, the way you might watch someone who has said something that rearranges the shape of a room you thought you knew completely. He had been assessing her as a liability, she could see that. As a human who had stumbled into something too large for her, and would need to be managed, protected minimally, and ultimately guided somewhere safe and quiet where she could be forgotten. That assessment was, in that moment, changing. "The people who fabricated my death warrant," he said, "control the primary access points to the Empress's court. They have spent 14 months constructing a version of events in which I died heroically and naturally, and the succession passed cleanly. The Empress is in mourning. She has very limited access to outside information. They chose this method precisely because it was the kind of grief that isolates. So getting to the Empress directly is the problem," Elise said. "It is the problem," he agreed. "Then we need an indirect route." She leaned against the wall, her mind already moving, pulling threads from 14 months of archival research, the organizational charts of the High Court, the old treaties, the secondary bloodlines, the alliances that predated the current power structure. The Von Alder line. They were historically allied with the Von Carsteins before the court reorganization of 1954, and there is a Von Alder representative in Vienna. I catalogued his estate correspondence last year, Count Tavian Von Alder. He is not court-aligned currently, which means he is not compromised. Tavian went very still in a different way. "You know Tavian Von Alder. I know of him. His correspondence suggests he was never comfortable with the direction the court has taken." "Tavian was my father's closest ally," Tavian said, "and my friend before all of this." He paused, and something complicated moved through his expression, something between hope and the very particular grief of a man who has spent a long time not allowing himself to hope. If he is in Vienna, if he is not compromised, he has access to secondary channels to the imperial court that bypass the High Council entirely. "Then we need to reach him," Elise said. "Which means we need to get out of these tunnels before those enforcers bring reinforcements." Tavian looked at her for another moment. Then he straightened to his full height, and the exhaustion she had glimpsed for that brief, unguarded breath was gone, or not gone, but pressed down and covered by the thing that lived underneath it. The bearing of a prince who had been born to lead and had not, in 14 months of exile and darkness and deliberate erasure, forgotten what he was. "There is an exit 200 meters north that comes up inside a private building I have been using," he said. "We can reach it without crossing the search zone." "Lead the way," Elise said. He picked up the lantern, and they moved again through the dark, and this time, when he checked behind them to make sure she was keeping pace, the glance was different than the ones before. Still protective, still assessing. But something in it had shifted from calculating the threat she posed to calculating how to keep her safe. And Elise felt that shift with the quiet certainty of someone who notices everything. The building was an old printing house 4 blocks from the city centre, 3 stories of heavy brick that backed up against a canal. Tavian had been using the ground floor for 14 months, and the evidence of that long habitation was everywhere once they climbed through the tunnel access in the basement. Stacks of books, candles, and their cold lanterns, handwritten maps of the city pinned to one wall with careful notations. A narrow cot in the corner that looked like it had been slept on very rarely because the vampire who lived here had spent most of his time planning rather than resting. Elise looked at the maps. Then she looked at the books. Then she looked at him and she said, very quietly, "You have been trying to find a way back to the Empress this whole time." "Every day," he said. "But I had no proof. Without documented evidence of the fabrication, anything I could bring to her would be a son's word against a council's record. She would be forced by the blood laws to believe the official record." His jaw tightened. "I could not put her through that. Could not make her choose between grief and a claim she could not verify." Elise sat down at the old printing table because her legs had finally registered 14 hours of running and suggested firmly that she should. "The document I found changes everything then." "It changes everything," he agreed, and the weight with which he said it was immense. She looked up at him. He was standing near the wall of maps, one hand raised to touch a point on the city chart, and the blue-white lantern light caught the lines of him in a way that made him look simultaneously ancient and absolutely present, like something that had existed for a very long time but was, in this moment, nowhere other than here. "How long?" she asked. "How long have you been down there?" 14 months, 2 weeks, 4 days, he said without hesitation. He had been counting. Of course he had been counting. They sealed the tunnels. They sealed the main access. There are older passages. The city has been layered over itself for 6 centuries. I know them. He paused. I had a great deal of time to learn them. Elise looked at the narrow cot, the stacked books, the careful maps. She thought about what it cost a man like this to spend 14 months in hiding, not just Etienne, a man, a prince, someone who had been raised to lead, to command. The center of a world built around blood and power and ancient vow. Someone who had been stripped of every one of those things, not by failure, but by deliberate, calculated betrayal, and had still, every single day, kept mapping and planning and searching for a way back. "I need to clean this cut," she said, because the moment was becoming something large, and she was not quite ready for it. He moved before she had finished the sentence. To a cabinet against the far wall, returning with a cloth and clean water, and something in a small glass bottle that she suspected was not anything available in a pharmacy. He sat across from her and held out the cloth. Their fingers did not quite touch in the exchange, but the awareness of the proximity was acute on both sides. She could see that it was, in the careful way he held himself, the deliberate precision of someone choosing not to crowd. "The Von Carstein blood laws," she said, pressing the cloth to her forehead. "The ones about humans in the court. The witness right protects someone presenting documented evidence, but what about after? What happens to a human who has been this deep in court politics?" He was quiet for a moment. When he answered, there was something precise and careful in his tone, the tone of a man who is giving a complete and honest answer rather than a comfortable one. By old world code, a human who assists in the restoration of a wrongfully deposed heir is entitled to the protection of that heir's line. It is the ancient vow of the protected blood, non-negotiable, honored even by lines who despise humans, so they could not touch me afterward, not without declaring war on the Von Carstein line directly. A pause, which, once my position is restored, would be a declaration of war on the obsidian throne. No court in the world would sanction it. She looked at him. "You are not saying that to make me feel better." "I am not in the habit of saying things to make people feel better," he said, and there was something so precise and so guileless in the statement that she almost smiled. "I am in the habit of saying accurate things. Sometimes they coincide." They sat in that careful silence for a moment, and outside the sounds of Vienna moved above them. The ordinary world going about its ordinary business, entirely unaware of the dead prince and the runaway archivist in the printing house's basement. "We need to contact Tavian von Carstein tonight. Tavian said. Before the enforcers report back to the council and they escalate their search, once they know you have documentation, they will expand beyond the tunnels. Agreed. Elise removed the cloth. The bleeding had stopped. Do you know how to contact him? I know where his Vienna residence is. I have been watching it for 3 months, trying to determine whether it was safe to approach. I could not risk revealing that I was as alive to someone who might be working with the council. He looked at her. But you approached me without knowing whether I was safe to approach. You were already holding a sword to my throat, she pointed out. The worst case had already presented itself, and I made a judgment call based on available evidence. What evidence? He asked, and there was genuine curiosity in it. You did not kill me. You asked questions first. A council enforcer would not have done that. She met his silver eyes. People who are on the wrong side of a situation do not generally ask questions. They just act. You asked. That told me something. Something moved in his expression that she was beginning to learn to read. Not warmth, exactly, not yet. But the precise, considered attention of someone who has just filed a piece of information in a place where it will be kept carefully and revisited often. We will go to Saravian tonight, he said, but we go together and you stay close to me. The enforcers will be operating in expanded teams by now. If they see a human alone in that district at this hour, they will know immediately who you are. And if they see me with you, then they will have a considerably more serious problem than a human archivist, he said. And the particular quality of the quiet danger in that statement was not a boast. It was simply a fact, stated by someone who had fought 14 months of enforced obscurity and had now had enough. They moved through Vienna at midnight, and Tavian Von Carstein moved through the city like a man reclaiming it, which was exactly what he was doing. He kept to the shadows out of strategy rather than necessity, his hand never far from Elise's elbow without touching it unless the moment required otherwise. When a pair of enforcers swept a street 2 blocks ahead, he pulled her into a doorway with one arm, pressing them both against the old stone wall, his body between hers and the street, and he was very still and very close, and she could feel the contained power of him like a change in air pressure, something that the body registers before the mind catches up. The enforcers passed. He stepped back. Neither of them said anything. They found Saravian von Alder's residence by following Elise's archival memory and Tavian's 14 months of city mapping to a tall stone townhouse with arched windows and a brass knocker shaped like a raven's claw. Tavian raised his hand to knock, and then the door opened before he could, and an old vampire with grey-white hair and an expression of absolute shock stood in the frame. Count Saravian von Alder looked at Tavian von Carstein for a very long, wordless moment, and then he stepped aside and said in a voice rough with something old and profound, "Get inside. Quickly, both of you." The next 4 hours were the most intense of Elise Whitlock's life, and she had spent 3 days being chased through Vienna, so the competition was stiff. Saravian von Alder was old in the way that very powerful things are old, the kind of age that is not frailty but density, like a stone that has been compressed by time into something harder than its original form. He had silver eyes similar to Tavian's, but lighter, almost colorless, and he looked at the photographs Elise produced on her phone with the focused attention of someone reading a sentence that changes the entire meaning of a paragraph they had already memorized. "I knew," Saravian said, when he had looked at all of it. "I did not have proof, but I knew it was wrong. The death was too convenient. The mourning period was used too effectively to isolate the Empress." He looked at Tavian with something in his eyes that was old grief and genuine relief in equal measure. "I am very glad to see you alive, boy. You are the only one in Vienna who is," Tavian said. "For now." Saravian looked at Elise. "And you found all of this?" "It was misfiled," she said. "Deliberately, I think. Someone in the archive was keeping it close but plausibly deniable, hidden in plain sight as an administrative error. Someone on the council has been maintaining a private archive of what they have done," Saravian said. "The old vampire habit of recording everything. They cannot help themselves. Even their crimes, they document." He looked at Tavian. "The secondary channel to the Imperial Court. I can send word through the old treaty network. It bypasses the High Council entirely, travels through the Von Alder alliance chain directly to the Empress's private secretary." "How long?" Tavian asked. If I send tonight, 48 hours, possibly less. The Empress has been difficult to reach, but the private secretary is loyal to the old line, and this," he nodded toward Elise's phone, "is exactly the kind of thing the old line would move heaven and earth to receive." "Then we need to keep Elise safe for 48 hours, Tavian said. "The council will escalate." Saravian looked between them. "You can stay here. This house has not been searched. I have maintained my neutrality carefully precisely so that when the moment came, I would have something to offer." He paused. "Though I will admit I did not imagine the moment would arrive with a human archivist and a prince who has been living in the Undercity for over a year." "Life is frequently not what one imagines," Tavian said, and there was a dry edge to it that surprised Elise, because it was the first time she had heard anything approaching humor from him, and it was very slightly unexpected, and it made him abruptly more real, more present, more human in the best sense of the word. Saravian gave them rooms on the upper floors, and he sent his communication through the treaty network before dawn, and then the waiting began. Waiting, Elise discovered, was something Tavian Von Carstein did not do passively. He spent the first day reviewing everything Elise had photographed, going over each document with the meticulous attention of someone building a case for the most important trial in the history of his bloodline, which was exactly what he was doing. He asked her questions about the archive, about how the documents had been stored, about the chain of custody, about everything that might be challenged when the evidence was presented. His questions were precise and intelligent, and he listened to her answers without interrupting, which was a quality she had come to associate with genuine intelligence, because there's only people who are actually thinking about what you are saying can listen without immediately preparing their next point. She answered everything. She knew the archive backward and forward. She knew the filing systems, the access logs, the cataloging protocols. She could account for every step of the document chain in a way that would be very difficult to challenge. At some point during the second review, she realized that he was not just interrogating evidence. He was learning how her mind worked, testing its shape, mapping it with the same careful, thorough attention he had given to the tunnels and the city streets, because Tavian Von Carstein approached everything that mattered to him with that quality of total focus. And at some point during the first day in Saravian's townhouse, she had begun to matter to him. She was not entirely sure when she had decided that he mattered to her. She thought it might have been in the tunnel, when she had looked away to give him the private moment of relief and grief and barely contained hope. Or it might have been before that, when he had asked questions before acting, when he had made a judgment and trusted it, when he had moved through the dark with that absolute certainty, and then turned to check that she was still there, still keeping pace, stay safe. On the first night in the townhouse, she could not sleep. She was too aware of the 48 hours moving past, too aware of the council's search expanding above them, too aware of the enormous thing they were attempting, and the very large number of ways it could go catastrophically wrong. She went downstairs and found Tavian standing at the window that overlooked the canal, his back to her, his coat off for the first time, and she could see the marks of his exile more clearly without it. The way he held himself was still absolute and commanding, but there were 14 months of hard living in the line of him. In the way certain muscles carried the memory of sleeping on stone, in the slight forward lean of someone who has spent a very long time moving through spaces too low for his height. He heard her before she reached the bottom step, of course. Vampire hearing. But he did not turn until she was standing beside him at the window, looking out at the canal, moving dark and silver in the October night. "You should sleep," he said. "I cannot," she said. "What about you?" "I do not sleep much," he said. "I did not before. I do even less now." She looked at his profile against the window. The scar along his jaw caught the moonlight. "How did you survive down there?" she asked. 14 months alone." He was quiet for a moment. "The Von Carstein line has always been hunted," he said. "Not always by our own court. We have survived things before that should have ended us. I had those examples to live up to." A pause. "And I had the maps, and the books, and the planning. It is easier to endure when you have a direction to move toward, even if every direction you try runs into a wall." "Until 3 days ago," she said. "Until 3 days ago," he agreed, and he turned to look at her. and the quality of the look was very direct and very present, and she did not look away. "What happens," she said carefully, "after this is resolved, after you return to the court? The line must be re-established. The traitors on the council will face judgment under the blood laws. The succession will be restored." A pause. "A great many things will need to be rebuilt. And the protected blood vow," she said. "You mentioned it earlier. It is binding on the line, not conditional on the circumstances resolving." "It is binding and permanent," he said. "Irrevocable once invoked." He looked at her very steadily. "I would have invoked it regardless of outcome, Elise. From the moment I understood what you were carrying and what it had already cost you to carry it." She said his name then, just his first name, quietly, Tavian. And he said her name back, with that precise, careful attention he gave to everything that mattered. Elise. They stood there in the moonlight by the canal window, and neither of them moved toward the other, not yet. Because both of them were people who moved deliberately, and not before they were certain. And the certainty was there, but the moment was fragile and enormous, and neither of them wanted to break it. What broke it was the sound of the front door below, and both of them went immediately and completely alert, moving apart to positions that covered different angles, and Tavian von Alder came through the hall, looking like a man who has just received information that changes the shape of the next 12 hours. "The Empress's secretary has responded," he said. "The Empress has acknowledged the communication. She is sending a delegation through the old routes. They will be here within 6 hours." Tavian's whole body changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but Elise, who had been learning to read him over the past 24 hours, with the focused intensity she applied to everything, saw the shift, saw the thing that had been pressed down and armored over for 14 months move in him like a tide. 6 hours, he said. 6 hours, Tavian confirmed. "We need to prepare the documentation and your presentation of events. The delegation will include Marevka von Siol, who is the Empress's senior counsel. She is rigorous, and she will want everything accounted for precisely." "She will have it," Tavian said, and looked at Elise. And what was in that look was a partnership. Clear and deliberate and already established in a way that 14 months of isolation and 3 days of being chased through Vienna had forged between them faster and more thoroughly than years of ordinary circumstances could have managed. They prepared through the rest of the night, Elise laying out the document evidence in a sequence that built an airtight narrative, Tavian providing the political context and the blood law framework, Tavian contributing everything he had observed and suspected during the 14 months of the false morning. Together, the three of them built something complete and damning and impossible to dismiss. The delegation arrived as the sky was beginning to lighten, moving through Tavian's basement entrance with 6 guards, and a tall vampire woman in dark silver, who introduced herself as Marevka von Siol with the brisk, precise energy of someone who has spent centuries as the most competent person in every room she enters. She looked at the documentation. She looked at Tavian. She looked at Elise with very sharp, colorless eyes and said, "You are the human who found this." "I am," Elise said. "The council will question your reliability," Marevka said. "A human archivist with no formal standing in the court structure." "The documents are primary sources with verifiable chain of custody," Elise said steadily. "I can account for every step of how they were stored and how I accessed them. The cipher I broke has been broken correctly, which can be independently verified by any code scholar in the court archives. The photographs are time-stamped and backed up to encrypted servers with access logs. Question my reliability if you like, but you will need something more substantial than my species to do it." A brief, charged silence. Marevka von Siol looked at Tavian. "She argues like a barrister. She thinks like one," Tavian said, and the quiet pride in it was unmistakable and unguarded and very clear. The review took 3 hours. Marevka asked every hard question, tested every link in the chain, pushed on every detail that could theoretically be questioned. Elise answered everything. She did not stumble, did not hedge, did not soften a single answer to make it more comfortable. She had spent 18 months building the knowledge that made this testimony possible, and she carried it like the professional she was. At the end of the 3 hours, Marevka von Siol rose from her chair and said, with the gravity of someone who is about to put the full weight of an ancient institution behind a statement, This is sufficient. The Empress will receive you. Getting to the Empress was not simple. The imperial court was housed below ground level in a location outside the city, accessible through a network of private roads and old-world transit systems that were, Saravian explained as they moved, deliberately designed to be very difficult to reach quickly. The council controlled the primary access. Marevka's delegation used the treaty routes, older and slower but free of council oversight. There were 3 moments during the journey where they encountered council patrols, and each time Tavian placed himself between Elise and the potential confrontation with a precision that was entirely automatic. The protective instinct of someone who has decided, completely and without reservation, that this person is under his protection, and that protection is absolute. The 3rd patrol was not a patrol. It was an ambush. 4 senior enforcers, who had been tracking the delegation through the treaty routes, which meant someone in the communication chain had been compromised, came out of a side passage with weapons drawn and the specific, focused intent of people who have been told that the documentation must not reach the Empress. What followed was very fast and very decisive, and Elise saw clearly, in those 2.5 minutes, exactly what Tavian Von Carstein was when he was not containing himself inside the careful disciplines of exile and planning and measured, deliberate restraint. He was extraordinary. He was also absolutely terrifying. He moved through the space with the complete authority of someone who was genuinely dangerous in a way that went beyond training or skill into something innate. Concomitant instincts of a bloodline that had survived for centuries precisely because they were very, very difficult to kill. When it was over and the 4 enforcers were neutralized and Marevka's guards were securing the passage, Tavian turned immediately to Elise, and the shift from what he had just been to the particular focused intensity he directed at her was instant and total. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said.
"You put yourself between me and all 4 of them."
"I did," he said simply. "Tavian." She looked up at him. There was something in the way she said his name that carried more than the syllables. "Yes," he said, with the quiet certainty of someone answering not the stated question, but the real one. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, along the line of the scar. He went very still under the touch, the way something extremely powerful goes still when it chooses stillness rather than having it imposed. And he turned his face very slightly into her hand, the smallest possible motion, barely perceptible and completely unmistakable. "Later," she said softly, "when this is done." "Yes," he said again, and the word held a great deal. They reached the imperial court 2 hours later. The Empress Tavian Von Carstein was not what Elise had expected, which was a testament to how effectively the court's image management worked. She had expected the formal structure of grief, the ceremonial mourning, the impenetrable composure of royalty. What she found was a woman who had been genuinely devastated, whose 14 months of loss had carved something out of her that composure could dress but not fill, and who walked into the chamber where Tavian was waiting, with the particular controlled urgency of someone who does not allow themselves to run, because running would require admitting how desperately they want to. She stopped in the doorway. She looked at her son. Her son looked back at her, and then the distance between them closed and Elise looked away, because that reunion belonged entirely to them. And she was already very good at knowing which moments to watch and which to protect with her absence. She stood with Saravian and Marevka near the chamber entrance, and Saravian, who was very old and had seen a great deal, pressed her arm briefly and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The formal proceedings began 3 hours later, and they lasted most of the day. The High Council members who had engineered the false death warrant were summoned under the blood laws, which meant they came, because refusal was itself a form of confession under the old code, and arrived in the Empress's court to find Tavian Von Carstein alive, and standing at his mother's right hand, and the documentation of their treason laid out across the council table in its full, irrefutable scope. Elise presented the archival evidence herself. She had spent 18 months in the Drava archive building the expertise that made her testimony unassailable, and she delivered it with the same professional precision she had given Marevka at 3 in the morning, clear and complete, and absolutely certain of every detail. The council's senior barrister challenged her 3 times on points of procedure. She answered each challenge correctly, completely, and without losing the thread of the larger narrative for a single moment. When she finished, the chamber was very quiet. The Empress Vorothea looked at Elise Whitlock for a long, assessing moment. She had the same silver eyes as Tavian, the same quality of attention that missed nothing. And behind the grief and the fury and the sheer controlled power of a woman who had just watched her son's betrayers exposed in her own court, there was something else in her gaze as it rested on Elise. Something considered and careful, and ultimately approving. The ancient vow of the protected blood, the Empress said, not as a question. Already invoked, Tavian said from his position beside her. His voice was absolute and left no room. Properly done, the Empress said. 3 members of the High Council were remanded under the Mortlack Code. 2 others had played smaller supporting roles and were censured and stripped of their council seats. The investigation would be thorough and take months, but the principal architects of Tavian's exile were in custody before nightfall, and the succession was formally and publicly restored to the Von Carstein line before the next morning. It moved quickly once it moved. Old vampire courts, Elise was discovering, could be extraordinarily slow to change, and then, once the old blood laws provided the necessary framework, extraordinarily decisive. The machinery that had been used to erase Tavian Von Carstein from the succession was dismantled with the same methodical thoroughness it had taken to build it, except that it took considerably less time to tear down than it had taken to construct. Through all of it, Tavian was where he needed to be, in the council chamber at his mother's side, handling the formal aspects of his restoration with the competence of someone who had been trained since birth for exactly this kind of political complexity. She watched him across the chamber sometimes, conducting an argument with 3 senior council members simultaneously, precise and unhurried and entirely in command. And he was a different thing in this context than he had been in the tunnels, but not a different person. The same essential quality ran through all of it, the same focus, the same refusal to be anything other than exactly what he was. He looked for her. She noticed that too. Across the chamber, in the brief moments between proceedings, his silver eyes would find her, locate her, confirm, and only then return to the business at hand. She did not think he was entirely aware he was doing it. That made it matter more. On the second evening at the Imperial Court, when the most urgent proceedings had been completed and the court had shifted from crisis response to the slower work of investigation and rebuilding, Tavian found her in one of the outer gardens, a stone-walled space lit by the same cold lantern light she had first seen him by, planted with dark roses that bloomed even in October because they were extremely old and had their own opinions about seasons. She heard him behind her before he spoke, which meant either she had learned his particular quality of silence over the past 4 days, or she had simply become so attuned to his presence that her body registered it without needing to. Both, probably. The worst of it is over, he said, is it? The council is in custody, the succession is restored. The investigation will take months, but it is running through proper channels now, with independent oversight. He paused. For the first time in 14 months, I do not have to map every exit in the room before I enter it. She turned to face him. How does that feel? He considered the question with the seriousness he gave all genuine questions. Strange, he said, and very good, both, simultaneously. He looked at her steadily. You said later, when this is done. I did, she said. This, he said, is done, or done enough. She looked at him in the lantern light. This man who had been a ghost, and was now restored, who had been alone in the dark for 14 months and had not allowed it to diminish him, who asked questions before acting and gave complete and honest answers, and listened without interrupting and made judgments and trusted them, and had put himself between her and every threat for 4 days, without once making her feel like a burden rather than a reason. What are you asking me? She said, because she wanted to hear him say it. I am asking, Tavian Von Carstein said, with the deliberate precision he brought to every important thing, whether what exists between us is something you want to examine in circumstances that are not an ongoing emergency. Yes, she said, I very much want to examine it. He crossed the distance between them and his hands came up to frame her face with that extraordinary, contained gentleness that was always more moving than force because of what it cost, and he said her name once, quietly, and kissed her with the focused, total certainty of someone who has made a decision and committed to it completely. She kissed him back with the same certainty, her hands against his chest, feeling the steady, contained power of him and the warmth beneath the cold exterior. The warmth she had known was there since the moment in the tunnel, when he had pressed his palm flat against the stone wall, and she had looked away to give him the private space of a man coming back to life. They stood in the October garden among the stubborn dark roses, and the lantern light made the world very small and very complete. And outside the garden walls, the old machinery of vampire courts and blood laws and ancient vows ground forward into the future. And inside the garden walls, for this particular moment, there was only this. The weeks that followed were complicated in the specific way that restorations are complicated. The kind of complexity that is manageable and directional, rather than the desperate wheeling chaos of the past 4 days. The investigation moved through its stages methodically. The council was restructured. The secondary relationships and alliances that the traitors had built over 14 months of false succession were unpicked one by one. Elise was involved in the archival aspect of it, which was both professionally extraordinary and genuinely necessary, because the Dravur archive contained more relevant documentation than anyone outside the archival staff had realized, and she was the person who knew exactly where all of it was. The Empress gave her an official role, not a court position exactly, because the question of a human's formal standing in vampire court structures was a complex and old one that could not be resolved by a single executive decision, but an advisory role with full access, protection under the ancient vow, and the kind of quiet institutional power that comes from being genuinely necessary to the functioning of something important. She worked alongside court archivists, who had never before worked with a human colleague, and navigated that novelty with the same patient, thorough competence she brought to everything. Some of them were difficult. Most of them came around, because the evidence of her capability was overwhelming and very specific, and in a world governed by old-world codes that placed genuine value on demonstrated competence, that counted for a great deal, Tavian was everywhere during those weeks. He was rebuilding the political structure of his restored position, which required an enormous amount of his time and energy and focus, and he gave it all of those things because they were required, and because Tavian Von Carstein did not do things by half. But he also found her every day without fail, in the archive, in the outer gardens, at the evening tables of the court, where the old ritual of shared meals was practiced even by those who did not eat in any human sense. He found her, and he sat beside her, and he asked what she had found, and what she had been thinking about. And he listened, and sometimes they argued about historical interpretations or political strategy, or the logical implications of specific blood law provisions. And those arguments were some of the best conversations Elise Whitlock had ever had in her entire life, because they were with someone who was genuinely her intellectual equal, and who engaged with her ideas as though they mattered. Which, to him, they did. They were careful with each other in the beginning, in the way that people who have been through something extreme together are careful afterward, making sure that what they feel in the aftermath is what they felt in the middle, and not just the residue of shared emergency. Both of them were thorough people who believed in examining things carefully before trusting them. The examination took 3 weeks. At the end of 3 weeks, Elise had a very clear and thoroughly examined answer, and when she told Tavian this, he said that he had been certain from approximately the 2nd day in the printing house, and had simply been waiting for her to finish examining at her own pace.
You were waiting, she said.
I was quite comfortable waiting, he said. I had waited 14 months for proof that I was still alive to anyone who mattered. I could wait 3 more weeks. She laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that carries surprise in it, the surprise of being seen completely, of having someone understand the shape of how you move through the world and work with it rather than against it. You are, she told him, extremely certain of yourself. I am, he agreed. It is a Von Carstein quality. We have been told it is insufferable. It is not insufferable when it is backed by something real. Is it backed by something real? She looked at him. Tavian. You took a sword away from my throat and led me through a tunnel and kept me safe through 3 days of being hunted by an entire court's enforcement apparatus and then testified in front of the Empress of your bloodline that my protection was non-negotiable. I think you have established something real." He reached for her hand, and his fingers closed around hers with that deliberate precision, and he said, "The court will have opinions." "The court has been having opinions since before the Roman Empire," she said. "They will survive having one more. Some of them will challenge the association formally," he said. "Under the old codes, a human in close relationship with a crown prince is a political complication of significant proportions." "I know," she said. "I have read the relevant sections." "Of course you have. My recommendation," Elise said calmly, "is that we deal with those challenges exactly the way we dealt with everything else. Thoroughly, accurately, and without apology." He looked at her for a moment, with those silver eyes that had learned to carry warmth without losing any of their precision, and he said, "The Mortlat Code contains a provision for human consorts of raining blood in exceptional circumstances. It has not been invoked in 400 years. The process requires presentation of evidence of exceptional service to the bloodline and a formal sponsorship by the Empress herself." Elise raised her eyebrows. "Are you asking me whether I would be willing to go through that process?" "I am telling you, the process exists," he said carefully, "and that my mother has already expressed that she would sponsor it, and that I would very much prefer you to have every protection the blood laws can provide, because I have no intention of ever being in a situation where you are not protected again." He paused. "What I am asking is whether that is something you would want." She thought about the life she had before, the apartment in the city, the quiet archival work, the ordinary world that had been so completely blown apart on the night she fell through a collapsed road surface into the underground. She thought about what it would mean to step fully into this world, to commit its complexity and its danger and its extraordinary, enormous, ancient weight. She thought about the printing house and the mapping on the wall and the narrow cot, and a man who had spent 14 months alone in the dark, keeping himself oriented toward the light. She thought about what it meant to find someone who matched the shape of how you think, and she thought about dark roses in October gardens and stone walls and lantern light and the feeling of being completely, unhesitatingly kept safe by someone who did it not out of duty, but out of the particular choice that is the deepest kind of care. "Yes," she said, "that is something I would want." The formal process, when it was completed 6 weeks later, was witnessed by the full restored court and overseen by the Empress Vorothea, who conducted it with the grave formality of an ancient rite and the particular warmth of a woman who had found in her son's chosen son something she had not quite expected and was very glad of. The challenges came, as Tavian had predicted. There were 3 formal objections lodged through the council, arguing various provisions of the old blood codes. Elise addressed each one in writing and in person before the court, bringing to each argument the same thorough preparation and complete confidence she had brought to every other challenge this world had put before her. She won all 3, which surprised no one who had watched her work. On the day the process was completed and the formal protection was officially entered into the blood records of the Von Carstein line, Tavian stood beside her in the great hall of the imperial court, and the Empress said, in front of everyone, "Let the ancient vow be witnessed," and the entire court was still for a moment with the weight of it. Later, when the formal ceremony was finished and the court had dispersed to its evening business, Tavian found her in the outer garden again, because the outer garden had become their place in the same quiet, unspoken way that places become yours when you have had an important moment in them. "The court is going to spend the next several decades adjusting," he said. "The court," Elise said, "can take all the time it needs." He smiled. It was a rare thing, full and unguarded, and it transformed the severe beauty of his face into something that she thought she could look at every day for the rest of her life and not exhaust. "You are remarkably unbothered by the prospect of centuries of vampire court politics. I am an archivist," she said. "I find long timelines professionally satisfying." He pulled her close then, and she went, and they stood in the dark garden with the city moving above them and the lantern light making everything very gold and certain and real, and he pressed his lips to her temple and said her name the way he always said it, with the precise, careful attention of someone who understands the full weight of the thing they are naming. "The court believed I was gone," he said quietly against her hair. I know, she said. You found me. You found me first, she pointed out, with a sword. A very tightly held sword, he said, and she laughed, and he held her more closely, and the October garden held them both in its careful, rose-stubborn dark. The investigation concluded in the spring. All of the council members involved in conspiracy were formally judged under the Mortlashko Code, the proceedings thorough and transparent in a way that the old court rarely achieved, because Tavian had made it absolutely clear that the restoration of the Von Carstein line would not be built on the same opacity that had allowed the betrayal to happen in the first place. It was a significant decision, one that created friction with certain old guard factions who valued the court's traditional secrecy. And it was the right decision, and Tavian made it without apology and enforced it without exception. The Draveur archive was formally reviewed and restructured. Elise led the archival review, which was the most professionally demanding project of her career and one of the most satisfying. She found 3 more sets of concealed documents during the process, none as explosive as the death warrant, but all relevant to the investigation, and she handled them with the same meticulous care and complete professional integrity she had brought to everything from the beginning. The archivists who had worked with her on the project, both human and vampire, produced a joint recommendation that the archive be reclassified from private noble records to a formally recognized historical institution with expanded access protocols and proper professional oversight. The recommendation was adopted. The director's position was offered to Elise. She accepted it because it was the right role for the right person, and she had always known what she was for. She moved between the archive and the court, and the space between them that was becoming, slowly and with the deliberateness that characterized everything they did together, their life. It was not a simple life. Vampire courts were not simple. And being the human partner of a crown prince in the process of rebuilding a wrongfully seized succession was not simple. And the architecture of what they were building together required ongoing attention and negotiation, and the willingness to be completely honest with each other, even when honesty was uncomfortable. They were both very good at honesty. It was possibly the most important thing they had in common, this fundamental commitment to saying the accurate thing rather than the comfortable one. It meant their agreements were real and occasionally pointed, and it also meant that what they built together was built on something solid enough to be reliable. And reliability, Elise had come to understand, was not the mundane thing its name suggested. Reliability was the most profound form of care, the one that did not require emergency or drama to sustain itself, the one that simply showed up every day in the exact shape it had promised to be. Tavian Von Carstein showed up every day in the exact shape he had promised. He was still dominant and certain and dangerous in precisely the ways that mattered, and he was still capable of the contained ferocity she had seen in that underground passage when the enforcers came, and he was still the most commanding presence in any room he entered, the quality of him that was simply inherent and not performed. He was also with her in the private space of what they were to each other, very gentle. Not soft, not diminished. Gentle in the way that strength chooses its expression, deliberately, and with full awareness of what it carries. She loved him for all of it. For the ferocity and the gentleness and the precise honesty and the rare, complete smile and the way he always knew where she was, and the way he asked what she had been thinking about, and then actually listened to the answer. She loved him in a way that was very clear and very certain, and that had been built from the ground up, through shared danger and demonstrated trust and the slow, thorough examination she had given it before she allowed herself to fully commit. He loved her with the particular intensity of someone who had been alone in the dark for a very long time and had learned exactly what mattered and what did not, and who had found in her something he had not been looking for, because looking was not a luxury available to someone living in an underground station, and that made it matter more, not less. The surprise of finding exactly the right thing in the most unexpected place. One evening in their first summer, when the court was quiet and the archive was closed, and the city above was doing the warm ordinary things cities do in summer. They sat together in the outer garden, and Elise looked at the dark roses that had been blooming stubbornly and without permission since October, and said, Tell me something about the Von Carstein line that is not in any document. He thought about it. She always appreciated that he actually thought about things, rather than answering immediately. There is an old tradition, he said, that predates the court structure entirely. When two people of the Von Carstein line make a true partnership, they plant something together, something that grows. It is not a formal ceremony, it is just a thing that is done. She looked at the roses. Is this yours? She asked. Did you plant these? He was quiet for a moment. I planted them the first week after I arrived, he said. I was not sure why. It seemed important to put something living in the ground. She looked at him. He looked back. The evening light was doing extraordinary things to his silver eyes. The tradition, she said carefully. It is for two people of the Von Carstein line. The tradition, he said, is for two people who are making a true partnership. The language of the old code uses line in the sense of lineage, which under the ancient vow of the protected blood is formally extended to the protected. A pause. My mother's counsel confirmed this. You asked your mother's counsel about a gardening tradition. I asked my mother's counsel about the extension of lineage protections, he said, with great dignity. The gardening was incidental to the legal question. Elise Whitlock looked at the dark roses blooming in October light, and in summer light, and in all the light between, and she looked at the man beside her who had planted them alone in the first week of a very long exile, and had kept them alive through everything, and she understood, with the clear and complete certainty she brought to all important conclusions, exactly what this moment was. Then we should plant something together, she said. Yes, he said. He reached for her hand, and she gave it, and the garden held them both in the long summer evening, and the roses bloomed because they had opinions about seasons, and in the old stone-walled space under the quiet sky, the court continued its great turning work, and two people who had found each other in the dark were building something in the light, carefully and permanently, and without any plans to stop. The years moved forward the way time moves when you are in the middle of something worth being in the middle of, quickly and richly, and with the kind of momentum that comes from direction. The Von Carstein succession was stable. The court was restructured along lines that were more transparent and more accountable than they had been in living memory. The Draveur archive became something genuinely important, a center of scholarship that drew researchers from every bloodline, and several human institutions that had quietly known about the vampire courts for decades, without having any formal relationship with them. Elise ran it with the same focused, thorough, completely unsentimental competence she had always brought to her work. She was also Tavian's partner in every sense that the blood laws allowed, and several that existed outside formal legal categories, but were nonetheless completely real, and she carried both roles with the same clarity of purpose, because she had always been very good at being exactly where she was. Tavian rebuilt what had been broken with the same methodical attention he had given to the tunnel maps in the underground, one section at a time, building on what held rather than pretending the damage had not happened. He was a good prince, which in vampire court terms meant he was difficult and demanding, and completely honest and consistently oriented toward what was right rather than what was convenient. And the court respected him for it, even when they found him inconvenient. He was still protective in the exact ways he had always been. He still knew where Elise was. He still put himself between her and anything that presented as a threat, with the automatic complete certainty of a reflex so deep it was prior to thought. She had stopped telling him this was unnecessary, because it was not unnecessary, it was simply who he was. And who he was had turned out to be the most important presence in her life, so objecting to the expression of it seemed counterproductive. There was a morning in their second autumn when she was working in the archive, and he came to find her, which was unusual at that hour, because his schedule was typically consumed by council business until midday. He came and stood in the archive doorway and looked at her with those silver eyes that she had been reading for over a year now and read clearly, and what was in them was very quiet and very full. She set down her work. What happened? She asked. Nothing happened, he said. Nothing is wrong. He came into the archive and sat on the edge of her desk, which he did sometimes when he wanted to be near her without turning it into an occasion. I was in the council chamber and I looked up, and I thought about the first time I looked for you across a room and found you, and I needed to come here." She looked at him. "You are sentimental," she said. "Underneath everything, you are actually very sentimental." "I am historically thorough," he said with great dignity. "I appreciate the significance of milestone moments." "Is this a milestone moment?" He looked at her steadily. "Every day with you is a milestone moment, Elise. I am aware that sounds absurd." "It does not sound absurd," she said, and she reached across the desk and put her hand against his jaw, along the line of the scar, the way she had in the passage after the ambush, and he turned his face into it the way he always did, that smallest possible motion that was never small at all. "I spent 14 months being erased," he said, "and then I spent 3 days being restored, and every day since has been somethings I did not know whether I would have." He turned to look at her fully. "I do not take it for granted." "I know," she said. "Neither do I." He covered her hand with his, and they stayed like that for a moment in the archive, surrounded by the records of a world that had been kept hidden for centuries, and was now, slowly and carefully, learning to be something better than it had been. And the light came through the high stone windows, and lay across the old shelves, and the careful documentation of everything that had happened and everything that was still happening, and it was very good. That winter, the court held its first fully open convocation, an event that had not occurred in its transparent form in over 300 years, where bloodlines presented their status formally, and disputes were heard by a council with independent oversight rather than behind closed doors. Tavian had driven the reform for 2 years. It was significant and complicated, and created considerable friction, and happened anyway, because he was not in the business of allowing friction to be a reason to stop doing what was right. Elise attended as the archive director and as herself, which in court terms was now a recognized category because she had occupied it long enough and thoroughly enough that the court had simply adjusted its framework to accommodate the reality she represented. She gave a presentation on the historical documentation of court governance patterns that was thorough and direct, and contained several findings that the old guard found deeply uncomfortable, and that were nonetheless completely accurate, and the room received it because they had learned over 2 years that Elise Whitlock did not present things incorrectly, and challenging her findings required bringing findings of equal quality, which no one had yet managed to do. Afterward, in the outer garden where the roses were doing their seasonal stubbornness again, Tavian stood beside her and said, "You made 3 council members visibly uncomfortable." "4, she said. "You missed Count Aldrevian in the back row." "Count Aldrevian conceals it better," he said, "but I noticed." She leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and they looked at the garden together and at the rose they had planted in their first summer, which had taken very well to the old soils and was now producing flowers of an extremely dark red that was almost black, and that caught the lantern light in a way that made them look like small trapped pieces of night. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Yes," he said. She turned to look at him. "You have not asked. I have been waiting, and you have not asked." He looked at her steadily. "I was waiting for you to indicate that you were ready to receive the question," he said. "I told you once that I am comfortable waiting." She searched his face and found in it exactly what she expected to find. The same thing that had been there since the beginning, certain and patient, and completely without doubt. "Ask," she said. He took her hands in both of his, and he asked with the precise and deliberate care he brought to everything important, whether she would bind herself to him formally under every code and provision available in both the blood laws and the human world, in whatever form she chose, and for as long as she was willing to have it. She said yes. She said it clearly and without hesitation, and with the complete, thoroughly examined certainty of someone who has looked at every angle of a decision and found that they all lead to the same place. He kissed her in the garden among the impossible roses, and the city moved above them, and the court moved around them, and the world was very large and very complicated, and very full of ancient vows and blood laws and forbidden histories, and the ongoing difficult work of making something better out of something broken, and in the middle of all of it, in the stone garden under the October sky, 2 people who had found each other in the dark held on. And it was more than enough, it was as everything. The announcement was made to the court in the formal way. with the old ceremonial language that had not been used in this specific form for a very long time, because this specific form was designed for a situation that had also not occurred in a very long time. The Empress presided. Tavian von Alder, who had kept himself carefully neutral for 14 months, and then spent the following 2 years being anything but neutral in his enthusiastic support of everything that had come out of that neutrality, stood as sponsor alongside the Empress. The court received it the way courts receive things that are unprecedented and that are also clearly, demonstrably accomplished facts. With a period of adjustment that lasted approximately as long as it needed to, and then resolved into something resembling acceptance, because the evidence was overwhelming, and Elise Whitlock had always been very good at making her case. They built their life in the space between the world above and the world below, because that was where both of them actually lived, in the complicated, extraordinary intersection of human scholarship and vampire politics, and all the old and new things that lived in the overlap. It was not simple, and it was not always comfortable, and it was precisely right for both of them, which was what mattered. In the spring of their 3rd year, Elise found a document in the archive that she had not been looking for. This seemed to be a habit. It was a personal letter, 800 years old, written by a Von Carstein to a human scholar he had apparently spent 4 decades being in love with, and the letter described the strange gift of finding someone who matched the shape of how you see the world, across every difference and every difficulty, in language that was specific and honest, and completely free of sentiment's more excessive tendencies. She brought the letter to Tavian that evening. He read it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She was the one who built the first archive, you know. That human scholar. The Von Carstein records mention her throughout the period." Elise looked at him. "You knew about her. I knew about her," he said. "She is in the historical record. She was apparently remarkable." Elise looked at the letter, and at him, and at the long unbroken thread of what people chose, and what they built and what they left behind in the world that could be found. 800 years later, by someone who was also in the middle of something extraordinary and did not quite have the language for it yet but was learning. "We should catalogue this properly," she said. "We should," he agreed. "Tomorrow. Tonight," he meant. Not tonight. Tonight they were in the garden, and the roses were doing the thing they always did, blooming without permission in whatever season they chose. And the city moved above them, and the court moved around them, and the ancient vow and the blood law and the old codes held their framework around everything, and inside that framework, in the specific small warm space that belonged entirely to them, Tavian Von Carstein held Elise Whitlock close under the spring sky, and said her name the way he always said it. Like it was the most important word in any language he had ever learned. And she said his back the same way, and the garden, and the city, and the long history of everything that had led to this moment held them gently in the dark. And it was, completely and without qualification, enough.